unit was obliterated. He was badly wounded, and that became his, almost as I say, his DNA. I call it DNA. That became who he was. He was 20 years old, already leading a platoon. That's what they did, the youngsters of that generation. He remained in the army, and he was appointed by Ben Gurion to lead Yechidah, was called Unit 101. What was Unit 101? Unit 101 was the reprisal unit that went behind enemy lines to do the dirty work that nobody else would agree to do. No other way to describe it. And let's face it, there is tons of dirty work that people like me and others can't do, couldn't do. So once they interviewed me, anyone who goes to Aliyah who's got a funny accent and speaks English and comes from an Anglo-Saxon country is interviewed by the Mossad to see if they can be a spy. They interviewed me for 10 seconds. They said, no, you can go. You won't be a spy. Wasn't to be a spy, obviously, right? But the Shin Bet, the Mossad, interview everyone to come to see if they can make you, and of course they take your passport and use your passport to kill people. It doesn't matter. That's something else. But Unit 101 was a unit made up of people that were prepared to do the dirty work that others like me couldn't do and wouldn't do. Okay, so he was responsible for a massacre in Cuba. It was in 48. But Ben Gurion always protected him. Now, Ben Gurion, as I said over and over again many times, Ben Gurion did things by word of mouth without writing anything down, so that historians would never be able to say, see, Ben Gurion was no different from everybody else. Don't make him out to be the big hero that Ian Lucas makes him out to be, which he is and will always be. So Ben Gurion always protected Sharon right the way through, but particularly in 56. Now in 56, if you remember, was the Suez palaver, the Suez disaster, another word for it. But Israeli paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines and took the Mitla Pass. Famous, the Suez, well, Milchemet 56, the 56 war is known for its great success in Israel going to the Suez Canal, but the Mitla Pass is the big battle. Very high casualties because he did things that he wasn't supposed to do. But they captured the Mitla Pass, and Ben Gurion, that was what we needed to do, leave Sharon alone. In the Six-Day War, he was a battalion commander, and he was one of the guys responsible for the wipeout of the Egyptian army in Sinai. And you've seen pictures of all the tanks and the burnt out trucks and the burnt out everything, right? Everyone gave Sharon the credit for that, which is not 100% true, by the way, because the Air Force, if you remember, in the first 20 minutes of the 5th of June, 1967, wiped out the Arab air forces throughout and had total control of the air. And once you've got control of the air, the tank battles become very, very different kettles of fish to create a thing. So Sharon did wonderful stuff, but, give a little bit of credit to the Air Force, which he never did. But the big thing that he was really right about was the creation of the Bar-Lev line. Now, the Bar-Lev line, after 67, was like the Maginot line for people who know history of the First World War. It was built on the Suez Canal as a protection barrier to stop the Egyptians crossing the canal. And because of that, the belief within the army, within the Israeli army was, we are safe now. Because this Bar-Lev line is so secure, what they didn't take into account was a lot of shortcuts that had been taken building this wall. A lot of the cement that was used was watered down by building outsourced. They outsourced, of course, to building builders. And to take shortcuts, they watered down the cement. And as a result, when the Egyptians came to cross the canal, this thing just imploded within minutes. And we've seen pictures. Anyone seen the videos that I made that are up on the web? The one on the 6-day war shows that very, very clearly. And he maintained that Israel's power was in its mobility, was in its ability to sholef mi'amot, as it's called, to throw things from the hip, to react without orders, if you like, to be able to do things almost without thinking. And he was right. But he still had to come on. There was a war of attrition. People remember when they used to bomb and the artillery used to go from both sides. He came down heavily on Gaza. And Gaza has become a very important thing later on when he's prime minister. He and Gaza had a history going right the way back to 56, never mind 67. And even before 56, when he was the head of Ma'av Echad, when he was the head of the 101 unit. So Sharon had a history with Gaza going back decades. Okay? And that's very, very important to remember that. Because when he retired from the army, he settled on his farm. That's always a question that's bizarre. There's very few private land owned in Israel. Most of the land is owned by the Keren HaKayemet, the little blue box that you used to put money into. But there are pockets of land, I don't know how, but that are owned by private individuals. He was one of them, and he had a farm in the northern Negev. And he's famous for his farm. People used to go and visit him and so on. So he retires from the army in 1973, before the war, and you'll see them because he's called back into the war. And then he becomes the politician. But here's what Ben Gurion said about him, which really hits the nail on the head. I'm going to read it because in case people can't see it. Were he to rid himself of his faults of not speaking the truth, and he was a liar, and Ben Gurion knew he was a liar, and distance himself from gossip, because he also was a bit of a philanderer in his day, he would be an exceptional military leader. Now notice the word military leader. Ben Gurion never saw Arik Sharon as a politician. He was the warrior sabra. And he should have stayed a warrior sabra. Well, it doesn't matter. That's just a personal thing. It doesn't matter. Anyway, so off we go. He played a major role in forming the Likud party. Remember, we saw that with Begin, how the Likud party came out of Gachal, and he was very involved in that creation because he got close to Menachem Begin. He understood where the die was going to fall. When the Yom Kippur War broke out, he was immediately called back. And there was a lot of friction between him and the leadership of the Southern Command, who were totally inept. And he knew they were inept. He crossed the canal behind the enemy lines against orders from above, got behind the Egyptian 6th Army, as you know, and changed the whole war, literally by disregarding what went on. In the election of 73, if you remember, we spoke about it with a bit of an error with Rabbi. This was Sharon, should have been. In December 73, he was elected to the Knesset as a member of the Likud party. So he now is a politician. And have a look at the results of that 1973 election. It's very, very interesting. Because have a look, you see the alignment. The alignment is basically the Labour Party, right? The Ma'arach, as it was called. Once again, if you look at this and compare it to the March 2021 election, you see almost exactly the same results. Two parties get over double figures. The Mafdal there, by the way, is a combination of three of the religious parties, known as the Mafdal. Yosef Berg. His son, Avram Berg, by the way, was also a member of the Knesset, became an anti-Zionist. If you ever want to read about Avram Berg, fascinating story. That's another day. But if you look at these results, you'll see that they almost mirror, in terms of numbers, where the country was split then. This is 1973, right? This isn't even the election of 1977. Come 1977, right? He forms a party called Shlom Tzion, just in order to get into the Knesset. And he gets appointed by Menachem Begin. Remember, 1977, this is when the Likud causes this upheaval, the Ma'apach, as it's called in Hebrew, and get elected and form a coalition with Yigal Yadin, the party I worked my nuts off, right, to find out I got Menachem Begin to power, which really did me no sleep, no good. Never mind, another story. But he gets appointed Minister of Agriculture on purpose, because he understood that if you controlled the settlement policy in the West Bank, you controlled what was going to happen to the future of Israel, to all intents and purposes. And that's where his mantra came from. Jordan is Palestine. Don't talk to me about the West Bank. Palestinians want to live in Palestine, go and live in Jordan. Don't be refugees, because there are more refugees than there are Jordanians in those days. So he immediately gets this kind of power. And his belief, by the way, was to settle on the hilltops. If you go and visit Israel, you'll see a large number, majority of the settlements were initially situated on the hilltops overlooking Arab villages and overlooking the area between the two rivers, or the river and the sea, right? Between the Jordan and the sea. So Israel, to all intents and purposes, again, controlled militarily what would happen in that land, in that territory. And that's why, for example, Jordan didn't go to war in 73, because King Hussein knew exactly what was going to happen. Anyway, so 1976 coming, he's one of the few votes against the peace deal with Egypt. Remember, Begin made this big thing with Sadat signing, they got the Nobel Peace Prize, Sharon voted against. Keep that in mind. Not only that, come later on, he then gets appointed Minister of Defense. And he is the architect of the war with Lebanon, the first Lebanese war. Second war, he's not around. He, once again, believed that Israel could make a deal with the Maronite leaders, the Christian Maronite leaders of Jordan, and set up with Lebanon, and set up a Lebanese state with a peace deal that would last for 40 years. That's what Begin used to say. Would last 40 years at least. And he was the architect behind that. And when you remember Ben Gurion's statement about if he didn't tell lies all that often, he basically led Begin a merry dance about what was going to happen in Lebanon. And again, if you see the videos, go and see those videos, you'll see it goes into detail. I don't want to go into it now. But the important thing is the judicial inquiry after the war. Now remember, the big thing that came out of that war was the massacres in the Palestinian refugee camps of Sabra and Shatif, where hundreds of women and children were slaughtered by the Maronite Christians who had assassinated Bashir Jamal, their leader who was president. And that's what the deal was going to make, and blew the whole thing apart. They went on a rampage and killed hundreds. The inquiry maintained that Sharon could have prevented that massacre. Israel could have stopped the gunmen, the whatever you want to call them, the soldiers, gunmen, going into the refugee camps. And they didn't. So in 1983, he resigned, and there's a great clip of his supporters saying, right, you forced him to resign, he's out now, but he'll be back one day as prime minister. The brilliant clip. We are Zor Lechem B'Tor Rosh Memshala. That was in Hebrew. Of course, everyone laughed. Yeah, that'll be the day. Yeah, Lech Ladai. Then we go on. I'm trying to rush you. I'm going slowly because we might just run over a little bit if that's not too bad. So here's again his history from 84 onwards. The big thing here is when he takes over from Netanyahu as the leader of the Likud, also a whole palaver at the Likud conference, shouting, screaming, performing, also a clip worth looking at. He gets voted as Likud leader, but the big thing is that during Shavuot, there was always been a deal of who can go up to the Temple Mount to pray. Because remember, it's important to religious Jews to pray on the Temple Mount as well, not just at the Kotel. But the deal was you can go up there, you can't pray a certain number there, and especially over Chagim, nobody was allowed up onto the mosque area. Sharon, as a member of the Knesset and a member of the government, says nobody stops me from going onto the Temple Mount. And off he went, and of course, all hell broke loose. And you can follow, the second intifada, by the way, was worse than the first intifada. Anyway, he gets elected prime minister. He then unilaterally puts out a plan to pull everybody out of Gaza. Soldiers, settlers, settlements, the whole palaver. And remember, Gaza, not the Gaza Strip, the Gaza area, which included the Gaza Strip, was very, very important economically to the people living in Gaza because they worked in all these hot houses. When we went shlichut, they were shlichim from Beitar, and he was from a moshav in that area, and they were paid $500,000 to leave when he pulled them. Cost the earth. The Americans, I think, paid for most of it. But unilaterally, he decided, very similar to what happened in Lebanon, but here it had much, much greater connotations and implications and vibrations. And of course, we today are reaping the fruits of this unilateral decision that Sharon literally pulled out of his hat. He left the Likud, formed Kadima, I'm not going to go into that, but in 2006, he had a stroke. But he didn't die. They put him into an induced coma, which lasted 8 years. The reason why it lasted 8 years was because his family refused to have the machines turned off. They used an halachic ruling, but behind it all was the fact that he still drew a pension, a huge pension, because he was an ex-prime minister, which his sons, his wife had died by then, his wife died earlier, were drawing, one of whom, Omri Sharon, sat in jail for fraud for a few years. Now, this doesn't sit easily with a lot of people. Israelis are barely managing to finish the month. Remember, this is 2014. It's not all that long ago. And these guys are drawing this pension while he's in an induced coma. Not simple. You can make up your own minds. So, what is the legacy of Arik Sharon? And then we've got beautiful timing. I think these are the four major areas that I think his legacy will last for a long, long time. First of all, there is no doubt, as the warrior Israeli, he sits as number one. Ehud Barak will disagree with me, it doesn't matter. Not good. Ehud Barak is the most decorated soldier in Israel, and so on. He was prime minister as well, but it doesn't matter. But it's comparing different periods in history, which I don't like to do. You don't take it out of context. But within context, and when the times that he was the warrior, that Sharon was the warrior, he was exceptional. Of that there is no doubt. As the politician, you get the flip side, where, again, it's a personal opinion, you can take it for what it's worth. The legacy of the damage left behind, whether it's the settlements in the occupied territories, which created, and that's where the last one sort of comes in, the two politician prime minister come together, and the creative facts on the ground is exactly the result of what he created, facts on the ground that could not be overturned, like the legacy of having 700,000 settlers in Yehuda v'Shomron, as he would call it, which makes a two-state solution close to impossible. Because there's no way in a million years that you are going to move 700,000 people out of their homes. Not Jews, not by Jews, and not religious Jews by religious Jews. Forget about it. Civil war wouldn't even be what is there. And we know from the two previous republics that just lasted 70 years, what happens when Israelis or Jews start fighting amongst themselves. We end up in Babylon, or we end up in London. And it's a very, very dangerous legacy, because if you don't buy a two-state solution, you then buying an apartheid solution. And that's where David and I are going to have this discussion about amnesty, the amnesty report.